They tell me I saved the Imperium, that my return was prophesied, that I am the avenging son, the last hope of mankind, the 13th Primarch risen from death to restore his father's vision. What they do not tell me is that the Imperium I was meant to save no longer exists. It died 10,000 years ago. What survives is something else entirely, something I do not recognize. Something that uses my father's name to justify horrors he would have burned worlds to prevent. My name is Roboute Guilliman. I was born to be the architect of human civilization. I wrote the Codex Astarte to preserve tactical wisdom across millennia. I built Ultramar to demonstrate that governance could be both efficient and humane. I believed in the imperial truth, in reason over superstition, in the potential of humanity to transcend its limitations through discipline and knowledge. I was wrong about everything. Consciousness returned in fragments. Not the clean restoration I had been promised, but a painful reassembly of a mind that had been shattered and imperfectly reconstructed. The first sensation was not sight or sound, but the awareness of wrongness. My body was not my own. Systems that should have been familiar responded with alien precision. The armor I wore was not the armor I remembered. The air I breathed tasted of incense and recycled desperation. They were chanting. That was the second thing I noticed. Thousands of voices raised in devotion, speaking words I recognized from my father's secular philosophy, but transformed into prayers. They were worshipping, not just expressing loyalty or offering respect, but genuine religious worship directed at me, at my father, at the Imperium itself, as if it were a divine construct rather than a political entity built on pragmatic principles. I opened my eyes to a chamber that was both familiar and alien. The fortress of Hera on Macragge, my home, but changed. Every surface bore devotional iconography. The Imperial, Aquila, had become a religious symbol rather than a unifying emblem. The walls were covered in scripture, not technical manuals or strategic treatises, but actual scripture. Prayers and litanies and devotional texts, treating my father's words as if he had been some prophet rather than a scientist and warrior who had explicitly rejected such interpretations. Marneus Calgar knelt before me. The chapter master of my ultramarines, inheritor of a legacy I had built, was on his knees in supplication. Behind him, rows of space marines in the livery of my legion stood in perfect formation, their heads bowed not in military respect but in religious reverence. "My lord, Primarch," Calgar said, his voice thick with emotion I had never heard from any of my Astartes. "The Emperor protects, and he has returned you to us in our darkest hour. The Emperor protects." A phrase I had never heard during the Great Crusade. A formulation that transformed my father from a man, albeit an extraordinary one, into a deity. I tried to speak, to correct this obvious deviation from doctrine, but my throat was dry and my body still responding to inputs I did not fully control. The armor of fate, they called it. Technology from the Eldar, the very Xenos we had fought to purge from the galaxy, now integrated into my body to sustain life that had been stolen by my brother Fulgrim's blade. "How long?" I managed finally, my voice resonating through the chamber with a power I had not intended. 10,000 years, my lord," Calgar replied. 10,000 years since your father was interred upon the Golden Throne. 10,000 years since the Imperium has known the guidance of a Primarch's wisdom. 10,000 years. The number was incomprehensible. Civilizations rose and fell in less time. Technologies were lost and rediscovered. Languages evolved beyond recognition. The Imperium I had built, the carefully structured system of governance and military organization I had designed to function in my absence, had operated for 10 times longer than I had ever anticipated, without the guidance of those who understood its original purpose. I stood, and the chamber erupted in renewed chanting, hymns of praise and thanksgiving, prayers for deliverance and protection, every word a violation of the imperial truth, every phrase a corruption of the rational foundation upon which we had built mankind's future. I wanted to silence them, to explain that I was not a god, that my father was not a god, that everything they believed was a perversion of what we had fought to create. They brought me to a council chamber within days of my awakening. My body was still adjusting to its resurrection, my mind still processing the impossible gulf of time that had opened beneath me, but they insisted. The Imperium was at war on 10,000 fronts. Decisions could not wait for my full recovery. The avenging sun was needed immediately. The chamber was grand in a way I found distasteful. Where Macragge's strategic rooms had been functional and efficient, this space was designed for ceremony. Every surface was worked with devotional imagery. The throne they had prepared for me was elevated above all others, a physical manifestation of the hierarchical thinking that had replaced the meritocratic principles of the Great Crusade. Those assembled represented the power structures of the Imperium. I recognized the broad categories, but not the specifics. Adeptus Administratum officials, their robes bearing the iconography of 1 billion subdivisions I had never authorized. Representatives from the Adeptus Ministorum, an organization that should not exist, dedicated to the worship of my father as a god. Inquisitors from an institution I had only the vaguest memory of approving in the chaos following Horus's betrayal, now apparently wielding authority that exceeded even my own in certain domains. And of course, the Adeptus Astartes, my space marines, though many wore colors I did not recognize, bearing names of chapters whose founding I had never overseen. The briefing lasted 14 hours. They spoke rapidly, using terminology that had evolved over millennia, referencing threats and situations I struggled to contextualize. The Tyranids, a Xenos species that had not existed during the Great Crusade, now threatening entire sectors with extinction. The Tau, another species, building an empire on our borders while we were too fractured to respond coherently. Chaos incursions on a scale that suggested the Astronomicon itself was failing. Orc empires that had grown to rival the Imperium in scope and power, and everywhere, rebellion. Human worlds turning to chaos or Xenos influence or simple independence. The Imperium was not holding the galaxy in iron grip as I had designed. It was desperately clinging to relevance, losing ground on every front, maintaining control through increasingly brutal suppression that drove more populations into the arms of our enemies. My Lord Primarch, an administratum official whose title required 3 full minutes to recite, said, his voice trembling with the honor of addressing me directly. The tithe assessment for subsector Venarius has fallen 17% below projections for 3 consecutive years. We recommend exterminatus protocols for the primary hive worlds to prevent further decline and set an example for neighboring systems. I stared at him, certain I had misheard. You recommend the extinction of human populations because they have failed to meet arbitrary production quotas? Not arbitrary, my lord. The official replied, seemingly unaware he had said anything concerning. The quotas are calculated according to the sacred formulae passed down since the age of the Emperor's glory. They represent the minimum contribution required to sustain the Imperium's holy mission. How many souls reside on these worlds? I asked, keeping my voice level despite the horror building within me. Approximately 47 billion across the 6 primary worlds and their orbital facilities, my lord. And your solution to reduced production is to kill them all. To purify them, Lord Guilliman. The taint of failure suggests deeper corruption. It is more efficient to cleanse and resettle than to investigate and rehabilitate. The precedent is well established. The official produced a data slate showing thousands of similar actions taken across the millennia. Entire worlds burned because they had fallen behind in their tithes. Populations numbering in the billions exterminated because investigation was deemed too expensive or time-consuming compared to simple annihilation. This was the Imperium I had built. This was the legacy of my careful administrative systems, my efficient organizational hierarchies. I had created a machine so vast and so focused on its own perpetuation that human life itself had become merely another resource to be calculated and, if necessary, expended. I denied the request for exterminatus. The chamber fell silent. Apparently, this was unusual. The avenging son was expected to rubber-stamp decisions that had already been made by the appropriate bureaucratic channels. My role was not to govern, but to sanctify, to provide divine authority to decisions made by mortals who had convinced themselves they were implementing my father's will. Over the following hours, I learned the true shape of the Imperium's dysfunction. The administratum had become so vast that its own internal communication required decades to complete. Decisions made on Terra might not reach the outer worlds for generations. By the time responses returned, the original decision-makers were long dead, their positions filled by successors who had no context for the orders they were implementing. The system had become a closed loop of bureaucratic momentum, perpetuating itself without reference to any external reality. The Adeptus Mechanicus had declared most technological innovation to be heresy. Rather than building upon the knowledge of the Great Crusade, they spent their efforts on archaeological recovery, desperately searching for lost STC systems, while the knowledge to create new ones atrophied. My father's vision of enlightenment through science had been replaced by a cargo cult mentality where machines were worshipped rather than understood. The Imperial Guard deployed troops using tactics and equipment that had been obsolete during the Great Crusade. Not because better methods were unknown, but because deviation from established doctrine was considered suspicious. Innovation was equated with potential chaos, corruption. Safety lay in perfect repetition of the past, even when that past was demonstrably failing. And the ecclesiarchy, the organization most offensive to everything I had believed, wielded power that rivaled the High Lords of Terra themselves. They determined which worlds were faithful and which were heretical. They called for crusades and holy wars. They trained military forces, the Adepta Sororitas, to enforce theological compliance. My father, who had systematically dismantled every religion on Terra to free humanity from superstition, was now worshipped by a priesthood that numbered in the trillions. How did this happen? I asked, interrupting yet another briefing on strategic deployments I could barely follow. How did the Imperium abandon the imperial truth? The council members exchanged glances. Several looked confused by the question itself. My lord, a senior ministorum official said carefully, the imperial truth was revealed to be incomplete by the Emperor's ascension when he took his place upon the golden throne to hold back the forces of chaos. He demonstrated his divine nature. The truth is not that he is not a god. The truth is that only a god could make such a sacrifice. It was a neat logic, I recognized. My father's greatest act of duty, his willing imprisonment upon the golden throne to maintain the Astronomicon, had been interpreted as proof of divinity rather than the desperate measure it actually was. And once that interpretation took hold, once an entire generation had been raised believing it, the next generation had no framework to question it. 10,000 years of accumulated faith had transformed my father's image from man to deity so completely that even suggesting otherwise would be received as insanity or heresy. I was not just outnumbered. I was temporally outmaneuvered. The weight of 10,000 years of belief could not be countered by the memory of a few centuries of reality. History belonged to those who had lived through it, and I was the only one in this chamber who had actually known my father as a man. The briefings continued. Chaos incursions in the Cadian sector, Tyranid hive fleets approaching from the galactic east, Necron tomb worlds awakening across hundreds of systems, Orc empires that made the Ulanor Crusade look like a minor skirmish. And through it all, the slow grinding collapse of imperial infrastructure, supply lines failing, communication breaking down, worlds going dark and never being reconnected. They brought me to Terra 3 months after my awakening. The journey through the warp was an ordeal that drove home how much had changed. Where once the Imperium had been dangerous but navigable with proper precautions, now it was a screaming madness barely held at bay by Geller fields that flickered and weakened with each passing day. Our navigator, one of the gifted humans who could perceive the warp directly, emerged from each translation white-faced and shaking, speaking of entities that pressed against our reality with increasing hunger. Terror itself was unrecognizable. The throne world of humanity had become a monument to desperation. Where I remembered gleaming spires and efficient infrastructure, now there were only endless layers of habitation stacked upon habitation. Billions lived in darkness, never seeing the sun, entire lives spent in the service of bureaucracies that existed only to serve other bureaucracies. The air was poisonous. The water was recycled through systems that could barely keep pace with demand. This was the heart of the Imperium, and it was a necropolis. The imperial palace had been transformed into a fortress cathedral. My father's vision of enlightened governance had been buried under 10,000 years of devotional architecture. Every corridor was a shrine, every chamber a temple. The secular meeting rooms where we had planned the Great Crusade had been consecrated and made off-limits to all but the highest priests. I walked through spaces I had helped design, now unrecognizable beneath layers of religious ornamentation. They did not want me to see him. That became clear as we approached the deepest levels of the palace. The Adeptus Custodes, the 10,000 warriors sworn to my father's personal protection, expressed concern. The Captain General himself, Trajan Valeris, argued that the sight of the Emperor in his current state might prove too traumatic for my newly restored consciousness. "I am the Lord Commander of the Imperium," I reminded him, using the title they had given me. "My authority in this matter is absolute. I will see my father." Valeris acquiesced, but his expression suggested he pitied me for insisting. That should have been my warning. The chamber that housed the Golden Throne was vast beyond reason, not because it needed to be, but because 10,000 years of successive High Lords had each added their own monuments and modifications. The actual throne sat at the center of a space that could have contained entire city blocks. Around it, 10,000 systems worked constantly to maintain my father's existence. Life support, psychic amplification, containment fields. Technologies from the dark age of technology that no one alive truly understood, maintained by rote and prayer and desperation. And at the center of it all, my father. He was not dead. That would have been a mercy. He was not truly alive either. The being seated upon the Golden Throne was something between states, a consciousness spread so thin across the Imperium that it could no longer meaningfully be called human. His body was a desiccated husk held together by machinery and willpower. Psychic power radiated from him in waves that made my enhanced senses scream warnings of danger, but it was his mind that truly horrified me. As I approached, I felt his consciousness brush against mine. Not the focused intelligence I remembered, not the brilliant strategist who had designed the Great Crusade, but something vast and alien and suffering. 10,000 years of agony had transformed my father into something I could barely recognize as the man who had created me. For a moment, our minds touched directly, and I understood what he had become. He was no longer directing the Imperium. He was no longer making decisions or guiding policy. He was simply screaming, a psychic howl of pain and rage and grief that echoed through the warp. And the Astronomicon, the beacon that made interstellar travel possible, was that scream given form and function. My father's suffering was the only thing keeping the Imperium's ships from being lost in the warp. I recoiled, breaking the contact before it could overwhelm me. Around me, the Custodes stood in silent witness. They maintained this vigil constantly, watching over a being who was no longer capable of acknowledging their existence. "How long has he been like this?" I asked, my voice barely audible over the hum of machinery. "Since the heresy, Lord Guilliman," Valorous replied. "The damage inflicted by the arch-traitor was catastrophic. The Emperor chose to accept interment upon the Golden Throne rather than allow humanity to fall into darkness. His sacrifice has sustained us for 10,000 years." Sacrifice. I repeated the word, tasted of ash. "You call this sacrifice? This is torture. This is a living death extended for 100 centuries. My father is in agony, and you have built a religion around his pain." "The Emperor protects," Valorous said, and I heard the automatic nature of the response. It was not a statement of belief, but a formula. Repeated so many times it had lost all meaning. I looked back at the throne, at the withered form of the being who had been my creator and father. During the Great Crusade, he had been a figure of such overwhelming presence that reality itself seemed to bend around him. Now he was a battery, a power source, his suffering converted into the psychic energy that held the Imperium together, and they worshipped him for it. They praised his sacrifice while doing nothing to end it. "Can he be healed?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Unknown, Lord Guilliman. Any attempt to remove the Emperor from the throne would result in the immediate collapse of the Astronomicon. The Imperium would fracture within weeks. Trillions would die as our ships were lost in the warp. And we have no guarantee that removal would result in either death or healing. He might simply continue in his current state, but without the ability to sustain us. So we maintain this horror indefinitely because the alternative is worse. We maintain what the Emperor himself chose, my lord. His will binds us, even in this." But it was not a choice, I realized. My father had been forced onto the throne by circumstance and treachery. Given the option, he would have preferred death to this eternal suffering. But that option had never existed. The needs of the Imperium had overridden any consideration of his own wishes. He had been sacrificed not because he was a god, but because he was too valuable to be allowed to die. And now, 10,000 years later, the Imperium could not survive without him. The very structure of interstellar travel depended upon the Astronomicon. Remove that, and every forge world, every agricultural planet, every military base became isolated. The Imperium would not fall to external enemies. It would simply dissolve into 1,000,000 disconnected fragments, each too small to survive alone. My father had saved humanity by dooming himself to eternal agony. And the Imperium had repaid him by building a civilization that made his continued suffering mandatory for survival. I left the throne room in silence. There were no words adequate to express what I had witnessed. The custodes did not try to stop me or offer comfort. They simply returned to their vigil, guarding a being who was beyond help, beyond hope, beyond everything except continued existence for the sake of those who depended upon him. In the corridors outside, priests moved in endless procession, bringing offerings and prayers to the God Emperor. They did not know that their God was not listening. That he could not listen, that every prayer added to the weight of expectation and devotion that had transformed a man into a mythological figure who bore no resemblance to the reality I had just witnessed. They gave me reports by the thousand, strategic assessments, resource allocations, tactical evaluations from every corner of the Imperium. As Lord Commander, I was expected to process this information and provide guidance, to make decisions that would affect trillions of lives across millions of worlds, to be the steady hand at the helm of an empire that was taking on water faster than any crew could bail. I retreated to the fortress of Hera. Surrounded by my ultramarines, in the chapter monastery I had designed millennia ago, I attempted to make sense of the impossibility I had inherited. The reports contradicted each other constantly. One assessment claimed a sector was secure, another reported complete infrastructure collapse in the same region. Resources that should have existed had been lost to clerical errors centuries old. Military forces that appeared in the official rosters had been destroyed decades ago, but no one had updated the records. It was in reviewing these contradictions that I first truly confronted what had become of my greatest achievement. The Codex Astartes. I had written it in the aftermath of the heresy as a practical guide to space marine organization and tactics. Its purpose was to prevent any single commander from wielding the kind of power that had allowed Horus to nearly destroy the Imperium. By limiting legion sizes, establishing clear tactical doctrines, and distributing space marine forces across the galaxy, I had intended to create a system that would be resilient and self-correcting. 10,000 years later, the Codex had become scripture. Not a guide to be consulted and adapted, but holy writ to be followed without deviation. Chapters that strayed from its teaching were viewed with suspicion. Innovation in tactics or organization was treated as potential heresy. What I had written as a framework for adaptation had been fossilized into rigid dogma. I called for Chapter Master Calgar and several of his senior captains. They came immediately, eager to receive wisdom from the Codex's author. I think they expected me to praise their adherence to my teachings, to commend them for maintaining the purity of the doctrines I had established. Instead, I asked them to explain why they had stopped thinking. The question confused them. Chapter Master, when did the Ultramarines cease to adapt their tactics based on field conditions? When did the Codex transform from a tool into a cage? Calgar's expression was carefully neutral. My lord, the Codex has served the chapter well for 10,000 years. We have achieved countless victories following its teachings. To suggest we have been imprisoned by your wisdom seems contrary to observed reality. I walked to the window overlooking Macraga's mountains. In my absence, they had carved my face into those peaks. A monument so vast it could be seen from orbit. The hubris of it was stunning. The Codex contains 900 pages of tactical doctrine, I said, not turning from the window. It covers void combat, planetary assault, siege warfare, rapid response, defensive operations, and a dozen other scenarios I encountered during the Great Crusade. Do you know how many different combat situations I have observed since my return? Calgar waited for me to continue. None. Every battle I have reviewed follows patterns established 10,000 years ago. The enemies have changed. The weapons have evolved. The strategic landscape is utterly different from anything I knew during the Great Crusade. But the tactical responses are identical to those I codified in an entirely different era facing entirely different threats. My lord, one of the captains spoke carefully. The Codex has proven its worth across 10 millennia. Its principles are sound, regardless of the specific enemy or circumstances. Its principles are sound, I agreed, turning to face them. But principles are not tactics. I wrote doctrine for fighting orcs as they existed during the Great Crusade. Have you adapted those doctrines to account for how orc military organization has evolved over 10,000 years? Or do you still implement the exact tactical responses I prescribed against a very different enemy? The silence that followed answered my question. The Tyranids did not exist during my time, I continued. They are a threat beyond anything I could have anticipated. A xenos species that adapts biologically to counter every strategy employed against them. And yet I have read reports of chapters attempting to use standard Codex approaches against an enemy that learns from every engagement. How is this rational? We have developed supplemental tactical doctrines, Calgar said, his voice defensive. The Codex provides the foundation, but we build upon it as circumstances require. Do you, I asked, walking toward him, or do you seek to justify necessary adaptations by demonstrating their compatibility with established doctrine? Is innovation accepted on its merits, or only insofar as it can be shown to align with what I wrote 10,000 years ago? The captains exchanged glances. They were not accustomed to having their foundational beliefs questioned, particularly not by the very Primarch who had established those beliefs in the first place. I did not write the Codex to be eternal, I said, letting frustration seep into my voice. I wrote it to preserve the tactical knowledge of the Great Crusade in a form that could be disseminated across the Imperium. It was meant to be a starting point, not an ending. Every generation was supposed to add their own experiences, their own innovations, their own improvements. Instead, you have treated my work as if it were sacred revelation, incapable of being improved upon. With respect, my lord, Kalga said quietly, deviation from the Codex has historically led to disaster. We have 10,000 years of evidence demonstrating that chapters which stray too far from your teachings often fall to corruption or become unreliable. The Codex protects us not just tactically but spiritually. And there it was, the real reason for the Codex's ossification. It had become not just a tactical manual, but a talisman against chaos. To follow the Codex was to remain pure. To deviate was to risk corruption. The practical had become spiritual, and in becoming spiritual had become untouchable. How many battles have been lost, I asked, because commanders followed established doctrine instead of adapting to circumstances? No one answered. Either they did not know, or they knew, and the number was too uncomfortable to speak aloud. How many space marines have died performing maneuvers I prescribed for enemies that no longer exist or never existed in the form described? Still silence. How many worlds have fallen because the Adeptus Astartes arrived following Codex deployment patterns that the enemy had learned to anticipate and counter? My Lord Primarch, one of the younger captains spoke, his voice hesitant. If we cannot trust the Codex, what can we trust? We have been raised believing that your wisdom was perfect, that following your teachings would lead us to victory. If that is not true, then what foundation do we stand upon? It was an honest question, and it deserved an honest answer. You stand upon 10,000 years of your own experience, I said, softer now. Upon the victories and defeats of countless battles fought by warriors whose names I will never know. The Codex was meant to capture the wisdom of my era so that it would not be lost. But you were meant to add to it, not worship it. Every generation of space marines was supposed to make my work obsolete through their own achievements and insights. Instead, they had preserved it like a fossil, a perfect snapshot of tactical thought from a specific historical moment, maintained in amber while the galaxy moved on without it. I am rewriting the Codex, I announced, and the chamber fell silent. Not to replace what I wrote before, but to acknowledge that it represents only one era's understanding. There will be new chapters covering the Tyranids, the Tau, the evolved Necron threat, and the strategic realities of an Imperium that holds only a fraction of human space. And more importantly, there will be a new first chapter establishing that the Codex is a living document meant to be updated by each generation's experience. The implications were enormous. If the Codex could be changed, then other documents considered sacred might also be subject to revision. If the Primarch himself declared that his own work was imperfect and incomplete, then what else in the Imperial canon might require reconsideration? I saw the fear in their eyes, not fear of me, but fear of the uncertainty I was introducing. For 10,000 years, the Ultramarines had known exactly what was expected of them. They had a manual for every situation, a prescribed response for every threat. I was asking them to think independently, and that prospect terrified them more than any Xenos horror. The Adeptus Administratum occupied the entire western sector of the Imperial Palace. A bureaucratic empire within an empire, employing trillions of scribes and calculators and assessors who spent their entire lives processing the data required to maintain the Imperium's administrative functions. They were, in theory, the mechanism by which policy became action, by which my decisions as Lord Commander would be implemented across 1 million worlds. In practice, they were the mechanism by which nothing ever changed. I had spent 6 weeks attempting to implement a simple reform, a reduction in the tithe, burden for agri-worlds in the Segmentum Pacificus that were struggling to meet their quotas due to climate changes caused by industrial pollution from neighboring forge worlds. The logic was straightforward. Reduce the immediate burden to allow resources to be diverted toward environmental remediation. Over a generation, productivity would recover, and the Imperium would receive greater yields than if we simply drove these worlds to collapse through impossible demands. The High Lord of the Administratum, whose name was Violeta Roskavla, and whose family had held senior administrative positions for 17 generations, explained why this was impossible. "Lord Guilliman," she said, her voice carrying the weariness of someone who had made this same argument countless times. "The tithe assessment formulae are derived from demographic and productivity models established during the reign of Lord Commander Solar Macarius. They have been refined over 3,000 years to achieve optimal extraction while maintaining minimal viable populations. To alter them would require recalculating dependencies across 17,000 interconnected systems." "How long would this recalculation take?" I asked, already dreading the answer. "Between 80 and 120 years, assuming dedicated resources and no competing priorities." A century. To make a decision that I could justify in a single paragraph would require a century of bureaucratic processing, and this was considered normal. This was how the Imperium functioned. "What if I simply ordered the change to be implemented?" I said. "As Lord Commander, my authority supersedes administrative procedure." Roskavla's expression did not change, but I sensed discomfort. "Technically accurate, my lord. However, the implementation would require modification of assessment templates used by 43 sub-departments of the Administratum. Each modification would need to be approved by the relevant departmental overseers, then transmitted through the appropriate channels to sector administrators, who would need to update their local assessment protocols and retrain their staff in the new procedures. The confusion generated by forcing rapid change would likely result in complete assessment failure across multiple sectors, which would cause supply chain disruptions that could cascade into broader economic instability. She was saying that fixing one problem would create 10 others. Not because the fix was wrong, but because the system was so Byzantine and interconnected that any change, no matter how sensible, would ripple through the bureaucracy in unpredictable ways. "How did it become like this?" I asked, genuine curiosity overriding frustration. "The Administratum I established during the Great Crusade was meant to be efficient and responsive." "What happened?" Roskavla considered the question as if it had never occurred to her before. "Scale, my lord. The Imperium you built governed perhaps 500,000 worlds at its height during the Great Crusade. The current Imperium claims authority over approximately 1 million worlds, though accurate census data is complicated by communication delays and the presence of lost colonies that may or may not still exist. To govern an empire of this size with the communication technologies available requires layers of intermediary administration that did not exist in your era. You are saying the problem is technological, not institutional." "Both, my lord. The technologies that allowed for rapid communication during the Great Crusade have been lost or are no longer reliable. Astropathic communication is slow, expensive, and prone to errors. Without the instant coordination you enjoyed, we require more administrators to handle local decision-making and more oversight to ensure those decisions align with Terran policy. Over 10,000 years, these administrative layers have accumulated until the system requires most of its resources simply to maintain itself. It was a trap of the system's own making. The Administratum had become so large that administering the Administratum itself consumed most of its capacity. They were not governing the Imperium so much as governing their own internal processes, with actual policy implementation as an increasingly distant secondary concern. "Show me the organizational chart," I requested. Roskavla hesitated. "The complete chart, my lord?" "Yes." She gestured to several scribes who began assembling data slates into a larger display. The organizational structure of the Administratum unfolded before me like an infinitely branching tree. Departments subdivided into sub-departments, which subdivided into offices, which subdivided into bureaus, which subdivided further still. At each level, there were oversight committees and coordination councils and review boards, all staffed by personnel whose entire careers consisted of processing information from the level below and passing distilled summaries to the level above. "How many people work for the Administratum?" I asked. Roskavler consulted a data slate. Current personnel estimates suggest approximately 140 trillion across the Imperium, my lord, though exact figures are difficult to determine due to the aforementioned census complications. 140 trillion people whose sole function was administration. Not production, not defense, not exploration or innovation or any activity that actually advanced human interests. Simply the management of management, an endless recursive loop of bureaucratic self-justification. And how many of these people are making actual decisions about policy or resource allocation? Roskavler frowned, considering. Perhaps 3 to 5% at most, my lord. The vast majority are engaged in data processing, record keeping, and ensuring compliance with established procedures. So, approximately 7 trillion people make decisions, while 133 trillion people process the paperwork resulting from those decisions. That is a crude simplification, my lord, but not inaccurate. I walked along the display, tracing the connections between departments that seemed to have no logical reason to be connected. Here was an office dedicated to assessing the productivity of manufactorums on Forge worlds. And here, separated by 17 organizational layers, was another office that allocated resources to those same manufactorums. The two offices did not communicate directly. Information passed up from the assessment office through 9 layers of management, was compiled into reports that were stored in archive departments, then was eventually retrieved by research offices serving the allocation department, which then passed recommendations down through 8 more layers to the actual decision makers. The same data was being processed 20 times by different offices using different methodologies, generating contradictory conclusions that were then reconciled by yet another office whose sole purpose was to explain why the contradictions existed. "This is insane," I said quietly. "It is the Imperium," Roskavler replied, and I heard no irony in her voice. She genuinely saw no distinction between the two statements. Over the following weeks, I attempted to understand how this system had been allowed to develop. The answer was simultaneously simple and horrifying. No one had ever tried to reform it, or rather, many had tried, but all had failed because reform required the administratum to reform itself. Any attempt to reduce bureaucracy had to be implemented through bureaucratic processes, which meant creating new offices to manage the reduction, which added more bureaucracy than was eliminated. And underlying everything was the fundamental truth that the administratum was no longer capable of determining whether its own procedures were effective. They measured their success by adherence to protocol, not by outcomes. A department that perfectly followed procedures but achieved nothing was considered successful. A department that achieved its objectives but deviated from procedure was considered problematic. I found reports from reform-minded High Lords dating back 6,000 years. Each had identified similar problems. Each had proposed similar solutions. Each had been defeated by the sheer inertia of a system that had evolved beyond anyone's capacity to control or even fully comprehend. The administratum was not corrupt. Corruption would have been easier to address. It was simply too large to function, too complex to reform, and too essential to eliminate. Trillions of people depended on it for their livelihoods. Entire worlds existed only to house its offices and archives. Quadrillions of decisions, most of them minor but collectively vital, flowed through its processes every day. I could not destroy it, but I could not fix it either. The best I could hope for was to occasionally force through high-priority decisions by invoking my authority as Lord Commander, knowing that each such invocation would generate years of administrative confusion and resentment. Mars had always been difficult. Even during the Great Crusade, the Adeptus Mechanicus had maintained a careful independence from the rest of the Imperium. They were allies, not subjects, bound by treaty rather than imperial law. My father had accepted this arrangement because the Mechanicus controlled technologies essential to the war effort, and forcing them into submission would have cost more than it gained. 10,000 years later, that compromise had become a cancer. I traveled to Mars 3 months after my resurrection, at the invitation of Fabricator General Belisarius Cole. The Archmagos had been responsible for my resurrection, having worked for 10 millennia on the project my father had assigned him shortly before the heresy. He was brilliant, heretical by Mechanicus standards, and possibly the only person on Mars who understood that innovation was not blasphemy. The Red Planet was even more transformed than Terra. Where Earth had been buried under layers of habitation, Mars had been transformed into a planetary machine. Every surface was covered in forged temples and manufactorums. The atmosphere was a poisonous mixture of industrial exhaust. The planet's rotation had been altered to optimize solar energy collection. From orbit, Mars resembled a vast clockwork mechanism, perfectly functional and utterly inhuman. Cole met me at his private forge, a facility that would have horrified the more conservative members of the Mechanicus priesthood. Where standard Martian forges operated according to rituals unchanged for millennia, Cole's facility was organized around efficiency and experimentation. Servitors worked alongside thinking machines in ways that teetered on the edge of abominable intelligence. Technologies from multiple eras and sources were integrated without regard for doctrinal purity. Lord Guilliman, Cole greeted me, his heavily augmented form bowing in a gesture that was more habitual than sincere. Welcome to one of the few places on Mars where the future is not considered heresy. You risk much by maintaining such a facility, I observed. The conservative faction of the Mechanicus would call for your excommunication if they knew the extent of your innovations. They have called for my excommunication 17 times, Cole replied cheerfully. The Fabricator General has protected me because my work produces results they cannot ignore. But you are correct that my position is precarious, which is why your arrival represents an opportunity I have awaited for 10,000 years. He led me through his forge, explaining various projects with an enthusiasm that reminded me of scholars from the Great Crusade. Here was a modified pattern of bolter that incorporated self-correcting targeting systems. There was an experimental power armor design that adapted to the wearer's combat style. Everywhere I looked, I saw innovation that the broader Mechanicus would have suppressed as tech heresy. Why has the Mechanicus abandoned innovation, I asked, examining a partially disassembled power core of a design I had never seen. During the Great Crusade, they were constantly developing new technologies and adapting old ones. Now they seem to view change itself as corruption. Cole deactivated the hololithic displays he had been using, his attention fully on me. The answer, Lord Guilliman, is fear. After the heresy, as the Imperium collapsed and the age of strife truly revealed its depths, the Mechanicus lost access to vast archives of knowledge. Entire forge worlds went dark. Technology was lost at a rate that suggested humanity would return to pre-industrial barbarism within a few generations. But they preserved what they could. They preserved what they could find, Cole corrected. And in that desperate preservation, they transformed understanding into ritual. If you do not know why a machine works, but you know that following a specific procedure makes it function, then the procedure becomes sacred. Deviation risks losing functionality you cannot recreate. Over generations, this evolved into the belief that the ancients who created these technologies were divinely inspired, and any attempt to modify their work was sacrilege. But you do not believe this. I believe the ancients were brilliant humans working with knowledge and resources we have lost. They were not divinely inspired any more than you or I are divine. And I believe that treating their work as holy writ prevents us from doing what they would have done themselves, improving upon the work of previous generations. Cole activated a new display showing what appeared to be a standard template construct system. The legendary automated manufactorums from the dark age of technology that could produce anything from clothing to starships with minimal human oversight. The Mechanicus searches for complete STC systems, believing they contain perfect knowledge handed down from a golden age. But the age was not golden, and the knowledge was not perfect. The STCs were tools, remarkable tools, but created by humans for specific purposes in specific contexts. We treat them as religious relics when we should be treating them as starting points for further development. You are saying the Mechanicus has mistaken preservation for progress. I am saying the Mechanicus has forgotten that there is a difference. They preserve what they can, which is admirable and necessary, but they have convinced themselves that preservation is sufficient, that maintaining the past is equivalent to building the future. It is not. Every year we lose more than we preserve because we refuse to adapt aging technologies to current needs. He was right, and the implications were staggering. The Mechanicus controlled the Imperium's industrial capacity. Every weapon, every ship, every piece of equipment used by the Imperial military was produced in Martian Forge worlds or their satellite facilities. If the Mechanicus could not innovate, then the Imperium could not effectively respond to new threats. Can this be changed? I asked. Can the Mechanicus be convinced to embrace innovation again? Call's augmented face was incapable of showing emotion, but I sensed hesitation. That depends on whether you are willing to force a schism, Lord Guilliman. The conservative faction controls the majority of Forge worlds and the Fabricator General position itself. They view innovation as corruption and will resist any attempt to mandate change. If you push too hard, the Mechanicus may fracture, and some Forge worlds may refuse to recognize Terran authority entirely. And if I do nothing, then we will continue our slow decline. The weapons we use will become increasingly obsolete. The ships we build will be less effective than those built 10,000 years ago. Eventually, the gap between our capabilities and those of our enemies will become insurmountable, and the Imperium will fall not because it was conquered, but because it became too primitive to defend itself. It was another impossible choice. Push for change and risk fracturing the one institution that kept the Imperium armed and equipped. Accept stagnation and watch that same institution slowly fail through its own inflexibility. What do you recommend? I asked. Gradual pressure combined with undeniable success, Call replied. I have been developing improved designs for decades, but lack the political authority to force their adoption. You possess that authority. Mandate field testing of new technologies. When they prove superior to existing systems, the evidence will make resistance harder to maintain. Over time, success will create its own constituency for change. And the conservative faction will resist regardless of evidence, but they will lose ground with each demonstrated improvement. Eventually, a generation will rise that does not remember a time when innovation was forbidden. That generation will transform the Mechanicus from within. It would take centuries, but I was functionally immortal, and the Imperium measured its existence in millennia. If gradual change was the only viable path, then I would walk that path regardless of how long it took. I gave Call authorization to expand his experimental programs and to begin selective distribution of improved technologies to Astartes chapters that would use them in high-profile campaigns. The results would speak for themselves, and each success would provide cover for broader changes. The Adeptus Ministorum summoned me to a meeting I could not avoid without causing an interstellar incident. The Ecclesiarch, spiritual leader of the Imperial cult, wished to formally welcome the returned Primarch and receive my blessing for the continued spread of faith throughout the Imperium. I did not want to go. Every report I had received about the Ministorum confirmed that it represented everything my father had fought against. A priesthood numbering in the trillions, commanding military forces, levying tithes in the Emperor's name, and maintaining the religious infrastructure that had transformed the Imperium from a secular state into a theocracy. But I went because refusing would have fractured the fragile unity holding the Imperium together. The Ministorum commanded the loyalty of quadrillions of Imperial citizens. To directly oppose them would be to invite civil war on a scale that would make the Horus heresy look restrained. The Cathedral of the Savior Emperor on Terra was a structure that defied both aesthetics and reason. It had been under construction for 3,000 years, constantly expanded and modified by successive generations of the faithful. Spires rose kilometers into the poisoned atmosphere. Devotional chapels could hold populations larger than the entirety of ancient Terra. Every surface was covered in iconography depicting my father in various acts of divine intervention, none of which had actually occurred. The ecclesiarch himself, an ancient man whose name was Baldo Sliced and whose body was more cybernetic augmentation than flesh, greeted me with tears streaming down his withered cheeks. "Lord Guilliman," he breathed, falling to his knees despite the servo motors that held his failing body upright. "The avenging sun walks among us. The prophecies are fulfilled. The Emperor's light returns to guide his faithful through the darkness." I helped him to his feet, uncomfortable with the display. "Ecclesiarch, there is much we must discuss about the nature of faith and the Emperor's true teachings." He looked at me with an expression of such rapturous devotion that I knew immediately no discussion would be possible. To him, I was not a man to be reasoned with, but a holy figure whose very presence confirmed everything he believed. The cathedral was filled with hundreds of senior clergy, each representing different orders and factions within the Ministorum. They watched our interaction with the intensity of theologians witnessing a miracle. Every word I spoke would be analyzed and debated and incorporated into doctrine. Every gesture would become symbolic. There was no room for honest discussion, only performance of a role I did not want and could not escape. Slist led me to the high altar, where a relic was displayed under heavily armed guard. He explained with reverent detail that this was a fragment of armor worn by my father during the Unification Wars. Whether it was genuine or not, I could not determine, but the faithful believed in its authenticity with such fervor that objective truth had become irrelevant. "My lord," Sliced said, gesturing to the assembled clergy, "these faithful servants of the God Emperor have petitioned for your blessing on their ministries. They wish to spread his light to the darkest corners of the Imperium, to bring salvation to those who dwell in ignorance of his divine love." I looked out over the congregation, seeing in their faces the absolute certainty of belief that could not be shaken by argument or evidence. These were not people engaged in deliberate deception. They genuinely believed my father was a god. They genuinely believed that worship was what he desired from humanity. And I could not tell them the truth. If I explained that my father had explicitly rejected divinity, they would rationalize it as divine humility. If I described the imperial truth and its foundation in reason rather than faith, they would reinterpret it as religious teaching. There was no argument I could make that would not be absorbed into their theology and transformed into confirmation of their beliefs. "The Emperor's wisdom," I began carefully, choosing each word knowing it would be distorted regardless, lies not in commanding worship, but in inspiring humanity to reach its potential. He did not seek prayers, but action, not faith, but understanding, not blind obedience, but intelligent cooperation in the service of human survival and prosperity. I saw them nodding, mistaking my attempt to correct their theology for affirmation of it. They heard what they wanted to hear, filtering my words through the framework of their existing beliefs. "The Imperium faces threats that require not just faith, but adaptability," I continued. "The galaxy has changed in ways that demand new thinking and new approaches. We honor the Emperor's memory best not by frozen adherence to the past, but by applying his principles to present circumstances." More nodding. They thought I was calling for a reformation of doctrine, not a rejection of it. They would go forth and preach about the need for adaptation, but the adaptation they imagined would be purely within the framework of religious thought. They would create new prayers and new rituals and new theological justifications for whatever practical changes I managed to force through secular channels. Over the following hours, I met with various Ministorum leaders. Each had their own agenda, their own interpretation of what my return meant for their particular faction. The debate between the redemptionists who believed humanity's suffering was divine punishment requiring penitence, and the salvationists who believed humanity was beloved of the Emperor and needed only proper worship to be saved. Between the purifiers, who sought to eliminate all deviation from approved doctrine, and the syncretists, who attempted to incorporate local religious practices into the imperial cult to ease conversion. They asked me to arbitrate these theological disputes, to provide definitive answers to questions about the emperor's divine nature and the proper forms of worship. I deflected where I could, giving non-committal responses that each faction would interpret as supporting their position. But they were persistent, and eventually, direct questions required direct answers. "Is the emperor a god?" a young priest asked, her eyes shining with a desperate need for certainty. "The emperor is," I replied, choosing my words with the precision of someone diffusing an explosive, greater than any living being I have known. Whether that makes him a god depends on your definition of divinity. He possesses power beyond human understanding and has sacrificed everything for humanity's survival. If that meets your criteria for divinity, then yes. If divinity requires something more, then the question remains open to interpretation. It was cowardice disguised as wisdom, and I knew it. But the truth that my father was an extraordinarily powerful human who had rejected divinity would have caused a crisis that would fragment the Imperium beyond repair. The meeting ended with blessings and benedictions, with promises of cooperation and renewed dedication. I left the cathedral feeling sullied in a way that no physical battle had ever achieved. I had participated in maintaining a lie, had reinforced through my presence and carefully ambiguous statements a theological structure that was fundamentally opposed to everything my father had fought to create. But what choice did I have? The Ministorum was not an external enemy that could be defeated militarily. It was woven into the fabric of imperial society so completely that removing it would unravel everything. Quadrillions of people depended on the Ministorum for education, healthcare, social services, and community organization. The priests were not parasites, but often the only imperial presence in communities too small or too poor to attract administratum attention. The faith, for all its perversion of my father's vision, served functions that the secular Imperium had proven incapable of fulfilling. It gave meaning to lives that would otherwise be nothing but suffering and labor. It provided hope in situations where rational analysis suggested only despair. It held together a social order that would collapse without the shared belief in something transcendent. I could not destroy it, but I could not reform it either. The best I could manage was to gradually moderate its worst excesses, to subtly discourage the most extreme practices, and to hope that over centuries the Ministorum might evolve into something less actively opposed to reason and truth. They wanted me to lead a crusade, not a limited military campaign with specific objectives, but a grand crusade in the tradition of the Great Crusade, sweeping across the Imperium to reclaim lost worlds and push back the forces of chaos and Xenos alike. It was, they argued, what the Imperium needed, a demonstration that the returned Primarch could restore the glory of the pet. I planned the Indomitus Crusade over 6 months, working with military leaders and logistics coordinators from across the Imperium. The scale was staggering. 100 newly founded Primaris Space Marine chapters, millions of Imperial Guard regiments, thousands of naval vessels, all coordinated in simultaneous operations across multiple segmenta. The goal was simple in concept: stabilize the Imperium's borders, reclaim worlds lost to various threats, and restore communication and control where both had degraded. We would demonstrate Imperial strength and competence, providing hope to beleaguered populations and terror to our enemies. The reality was far more complicated. The first campaign of the Indomitus Crusade targeted the Espandor system in Ultramar, which had fallen to a combined Chaos and Dark Eldar invasion. Intelligence suggested approximately 10 million hostile combatants occupying a system that had once housed 40 billion Imperial citizens. A straightforward military operation. Deploy overwhelming force, eliminate the enemy, liberate the surviving population. We deployed 3 Space Marine chapters, including my own Ultramarines, supported by 5 million Imperial Guard and a naval battle group of sufficient strength to control the system's void space. The operation was, from a military perspective, a complete success. We destroyed the Chaos forces within 3 weeks, cleansed the Dark Eldar raiders from the system within another 2 weeks, and secured all major population centers by the end of the second month. Then I visited the surface and understood what we had actually accomplished. Espandor's primary hive city had housed 20 billion people before the invasion. We liberated approximately 3 million survivors. The rest had been killed in the initial invasion, consumed by chaos rituals, taken as slaves by the Dark Eldar, or died during our own liberation due to collateral damage from orbital bombardment and urban combat. 3 million survivors from a population of 20 billion. And these survivors were not celebrating their liberation. They were traumatized, starving, and justifiably terrified of what would come next, because liberation was only the first problem. Espandor's infrastructure was destroyed. Its industrial capacity reduced to rubble. Its agricultural systems contaminated by chaos corruption that would take decades to fully purge. The world could no longer support even its tiny remaining population without massive external assistance. And that assistance, I learned from administratum assessments, would not be forthcoming. Espandor was deemed a low-priority recovery target. The resources required to rebuild it could be better spent securing worlds that had not yet fallen or reinforcing systems with existing industrial capacity. In the cold calculus of imperial logistics, it was more efficient to abandon Espandor than to save it. What happens to the survivors? I asked the administratum coordinator assigned to the liberation assessment. They will be evacuated and resettled on worlds requiring additional labor, he replied without emotion. Espandor will be maintained as a monitoring station to ensure no remaining chaos taint spreads to neighboring systems, but full resettlement is not economically viable given current resource constraints. So we liberated them from slavery and death only to scatter them across the Imperium as refugee labor. We provided them with imperial protection and the opportunity to contribute to the Emperor's realm, the coordinator corrected. It is a significantly better outcome than chaos consumption or Dark Eldar torment. He was not wrong, exactly, but his answer demonstrated the fundamental problem with the Imperium's approach to governance. We measured success by survival, not by quality of life. We saved populations only to condemn them to existences that might be marginally better than death, but bore no resemblance to actual prosperity or dignity. The pattern repeated across the Indomitus Crusade. We reclaimed worlds at a pace that generated triumphant reports and inspiring propaganda. We destroyed enemy forces and restored imperial authority, and in doing so, we revealed the hollowness of imperial power. Because restoration did not mean rebuilding. It meant establishing a bare minimum of control and then moving on, leaving the liberated populations to fend for themselves with whatever resources happened to survive the liberation. Most worlds that we reclaimed would spend generations recovering, assuming they recovered at all. Some would simply be added to the endless list of imperial territories that existed on paper but had no meaningful connection to Terra's authority. On Gallatin Prime, we liberated a forge world from Orc occupation only to discover that the Adeptus Mechanicus lacked the resources to restart its manufactorums. The specialized personnel required to operate the forges had been killed in the invasion. The knowledge of the facility's operations had been stored in cogitators that had been destroyed. The world would remain Imperial territory, but its industrial capacity was permanently lost. On Nemengast, we drove off Tyranid splinter forces before they could fully consume the population, saving approximately 2 billion lives. But the Tyranids had already stripped the world of most organic material. The survivors faced slow starvation because the ecosystem could no longer support them. We would have saved more lives by evacuating the population before the Tyranids arrived, but that would have required abandoning the world itself, which was politically unacceptable. On Cartus, We discovered that the Imperial governor who had called for liberation had exaggerated the chaos threat to draw military forces that he then attempted to use in a private war against a neighboring system. We removed him from power, but doing so destabilized a region that had been relatively peaceful. Our intervention created problems where none had existed. The Indomitus Crusade was succeeding militarily and failing strategically. We were winning battles while losing the civilization those battles were meant to protect. 3 years into the crusade, I called for an assessment of our long-term impact. The analysis was damning. Of the 437 worlds we had liberated, only 62 had achieved meaningful recovery of their pre-invasion economic capacity. 183 had been effectively abandoned after liberation, their populations evacuated or left to survive without Imperial support. 109 had required ongoing military occupation to prevent their immediate collapse back into enemy hands. 73 had developed new problems as a direct result of our intervention. We were not restoring the Imperium. We were performing triage on a dying civilization, temporarily stabilizing symptoms, while the underlying disease progressed unchecked. And the truly horrifying realization was that this represented the best possible effort. The Indomitus Crusade commanded resources and attention that no other military operation could match. I personally oversaw strategy and responded to problems as they emerged. We had the finest troops, the most advanced equipment, the strongest possible command structure. And still, we failed to do more than delay collapse. If the Indomitus Crusade, with all its advantages and priority access to Imperial resources, could not effectively restore liberated worlds, then no military campaign could. The problem was not execution, but conception. The Imperium no longer possessed the capacity to govern effectively at its current scale. We could control territory, but we could not maintain the civilization that made control meaningful. Mortarion came to Ultramar. My brother, transformed by chaos into a demon Primarch, led the forces of Nurgle in an invasion of my home territory. It was personal in a way that most threats were not. He was not simply attacking Imperial territory. He was attacking the civilization I had built as a direct rebuke to everything I believed. The Plague Wars lasted for 12 years. 12 years of grinding defensive combat against an enemy that turned victory itself into a weapon. Every battle we won spread Nurgle's corruption further. Every position we held became a breeding ground for disease. Every world we successfully defended was left contaminated and dying. I fought my brother directly 3 times during those 12 years. Each encounter was a philosophical debate conducted through violence, with every blow carrying an argument about the nature of the Imperium and humanity's place in the galaxy. He had not come simply to conquer. He had come to prove a point. The Imperium is already dead, Roboute. Mortarion told me during our first confrontation in the ruins of Ajax. You refuse to acknowledge it. Your precious civilization is a corpse being puppeted by bureaucratic momentum. I have come to show you the truth of decay and acceptance. I struck him with the Emperor's sword, one of the few weapons capable of truly harming a demon Primarch. He laughed as the blade burned his corrupted flesh. You cling to the past, he continued, blocking my next attack with casual contempt. Father's vision was always doomed. Humanity cannot be ordered into perfection. It rots naturally, inevitably. I have simply accepted what you refuse to see. I could not argue while fighting, but his words echoed in my mind, even as I drove him back through sheer determination. Because he was not entirely wrong. The Imperium was decaying. My own assessments confirmed it. The question was whether that decay was inevitable, as Mortarion claimed, or the result of failures that could still be corrected. The Plague Wars forced me to confront the limits of my ability to protect even Ultramar, the region I had personally built and maintained for centuries before the heresy. Nurgle's corruption was not a military problem, but an existential one. It transformed environments at the molecular level, rewriting the fundamental biology of entire ecosystems. Traditional decontamination protocols were ineffective. Worlds that we saved from Mortarian's invasion were still dying, just more slowly. On Parmenio, a garden world that had been the jewel of Ultramar, I walked through forests that had been transformed into nightmare landscapes of writhing fungal growth. The trees still stood, but they were no longer trees. They were hosts to diseases that existed partially in real space and partially in the warp, diseases that could not be cured because they were not purely biological. The population had been evacuated successfully. We had saved approximately 4 billion lives by recognizing early that the world itself could not be saved. But evacuation meant abandoning centuries of infrastructure and cultural heritage. Parmenio had been settled for 8,000 years. Families had lived there for hundreds of generations, and we had been forced to tell them that their home was gone forever, that the world they knew no longer existed and never would again. This was the true cost of the plague wars, not just lives lost in battle, but the permanent destruction of worlds that could never be reclaimed. Nurgle's corruption did not simply kill, it transformed, creating spaces that were no longer suitable for human habitation, but which could not be cleansed without destroying the world itself. I met with the refugees from Parmenio in temporary camps on neighboring worlds. They asked me when they could return home. I had to explain that they could not, that their home no longer existed in any meaningful sense, that they would be resettled on other worlds, scattered across Ultramar to fill population gaps where the constant wars had created labor shortages. They accepted this with the stoic resignation of Imperial citizens accustomed to suffering. But I saw the defeat in their eyes. They had survived, but everything that made their survival meaningful had been taken from them. During my second confrontation with Mortarion on the orbital stations above Ardium, he pressed his philosophical assault with renewed vigor. "Look at what you are preserving, brother." He gestured toward the viewports showing the planet below, where our forces were locked in combat across 3 continents. "You fight to maintain an Imperium that grinds its own citizens into suffering, that burns worlds to maintain quotas, that transforms human life into statistics to be calculated and expended. I offer release from that grinding machinery, acceptance of the inevitable rather than futile resistance." I parried his rusted scythe, the silence, and counterattacked. "Your offer is oblivion, dressed as peace, death masquerading as acceptance." "No," Mortarion corrected, easily deflecting my strike. "Life masquerading as progress. Your Imperium is the true death Roboute. A spiritual death that maintains biological function while crushing everything that makes that function meaningful. I, at least, am honest about what I offer." The worst part was that his words contained fragments of truth. The Imperium did grind its citizens. It did treat human life as expendable. It did perpetuate suffering in service to an increasingly hollow dream of order. But the alternative Mortarion offered was not freedom or release. It was surrender to forces that would transform humanity into something unrecognizable, that would erase everything my father had fought to preserve. I drove Mortarion back again, but I could not kill him. Demon Primarchs could not be permanently destroyed in real space. They could only be banished, forced back into the warp to recover before returning. I could win tactical victories, but the strategic reality was that Mortarion could continue this war indefinitely while I aged and weakened. Except I would not age or weaken, not significantly. The armor of fate that sustained my life also prevented the normal degradation of time. I was functionally immortal, like my brother. We could fight this war for centuries if necessary, each battle a repeat of the previous one, neither side capable of achieving permanent victory. That realization was more horrifying than anything Mortarion had said. The future stretched before me as an endless series of wars just like this one. I would fight and win and watch everything I preserved slowly decay despite my victories. I would banish my brothers back to the warp again and again, knowing they would return. I would hold together an Imperium that was collapsing under its own weight, buying time for a recovery that might never come. The Plague Wars ended not with a decisive battle, but with Mortarion's strategic withdrawal. He had made his point. Ultramar survived, but it was diminished. 8 worlds had been permanently abandoned due to irreversible corruption. 14 more were under centuries-long quarantine, while decontamination efforts continued. The population of Ultramar had declined by approximately 30%, and full recovery would require resources that the broader Imperium could not spare. I returned to Terra after the Plague Wars to find the Imperium exactly as I had left it. Wars on 10,000 fronts. Bureaucratic paralysis choking any attempt at reform. The Administratum processing reports about battles that had ended decades before. The Ministorum calling for faith while worlds burned. The Mechanicus maintaining their rituals while technologies failed. Nothing changed, nothing improved. The same problems I had identified years before continued unabated, and my efforts to address them had accomplished almost nothing. I retreated to my private chambers in the Imperial Palace. For the first time since my resurrection, I allowed myself to stop, to rest, to simply exist without the constant demands of command. The silence was overwhelming. For centuries during the Great Crusade, I had been surrounded by activity and purpose. Every decision mattered. Every action contributed to humanity's expansion and improvement. There had been problems, certainly, but they were problems that could be solved through sufficient application of intelligence and force. The galaxy had been resistant, but ultimately yielding. Progress was possible. Now I commanded the Imperium not because it could be improved, but because someone had to maintain it while it died. I made decisions that would be implemented decades after my death, if I were mortal, by which time the circumstances that prompted them would have changed beyond recognition. I fought wars that created as many problems as they solved. I struggled against institutional inertia that defeated every attempt at reform. And the fundamental truth underlying everything was that I was alone. The only person in the Imperium who remembered what we had been trying to build. The only voice arguing for the imperial truth in a civilization that had abandoned it. The only leader who understood that the current system was unsustainable, but who also understood that any attempt to replace it would cause collapse before any alternative could be established. I had been resurrected to save the Imperium, but the Imperium was already dead. What survived was something else. Something that bore the name and symbols of my father's vision while embodying everything he had fought against. And my role was not to restore what had been lost, but to maintain this corrupted version, because even a corrupted Imperium was better than the chaos that would follow its complete collapse. I thought about Mortarion's offer, not seriously considering it, but examining it as a philosophical position. He offered acceptance of decay as a natural process, release from the futile struggle to maintain order against entropy. And there was a terrible logic to it. If the Imperium was doomed regardless of my efforts, why continue the struggle? Why not accept the inevitable and find peace and surrender? The answer, I realized, was not because victory was possible. It was because surrender would doom trillions of human lives that might otherwise survive. Not thrive, perhaps. Not achieve the potential my father had envisioned. But survive. Continue. Persist in the face of overwhelming opposition and impossible odds. That was what the Imperium had become. Not a civilization building toward a better future, but a survival mechanism that kept humanity alive through sheer brutal efficiency. And that survival, however diminished and compromised, was worth preserving. I could not restore the Imperium my father had built. That Imperium was gone, destroyed by the heresy and the 10,000 years of drift that followed. But I could maintain what existed, could buy time for populations that would otherwise die, could hold back the darkness a little longer. They ask me for wisdom, guidance, direction for an Imperium that has forgotten how to function without explicit instruction from figures they regard as divine. And I give them what I can. Tactical recommendations, administrative reforms, strategic priorities, all of it filtered through my understanding that most of what I suggest will be ignored or implemented so poorly that it becomes worthless. But occasionally, rarely, I am asked questions that cannot be answered with policy recommendations. Questions about purpose and meaning, about why we struggle when the struggle appears futile, about whether humanity has a future worth fighting for. I was asked such a question by a young ultramarine, newly elevated to full battle brother status, standing guard during a strategic session on McCraig. He approached during a break, his posture hesitant but determined. "Lord Guilliman," he said, his voice carefully neutral in the way of a status trained to suppress emotion. "If I may ask a question beyond my station." I nodded, curious. "Speak freely, brother. Why do we fight?" He paused, clearly wrestling with how to express his concern. "I have reviewed the strategic assessments. I understand our tactical objectives, but the larger purpose, the Imperium we defend, is not the Imperium described in our chapter's histories. It is corrupt, inefficient, and cruel. We preserve a civilization that seems designed to create suffering. Why?" It was the most honest question I had been asked since my resurrection. This young warrior had looked at the Imperium without the filters of faith or indoctrination and had seen what I saw. The rot, the dysfunction, the fundamental injustice of a system that had abandoned everything it was meant to protect. "The Imperium we defend," I said carefully, "is not the civilization my father envisioned. It has failed by almost every measure of success we established during the Great Crusade. It is precisely as you describe it, corrupt, inefficient, often cruel. Then why preserve it, my lord? Because the alternative is worse." I walked to the window overlooking Macraga's mountains. "Do you know what would happen if the Imperium fell tomorrow? If we simply stopped fighting and allowed our enemies to claim human space? Chaos would consume most worlds." He recited the obvious answer. "Eventually, yes. But first would come the collapse of interstellar trade and communication. Forge worlds would stop producing equipment, agricultural worlds would stop exporting food, military forces would be scattered and isolated. Most human populations would die not from enemy action, but from simple systemic failure. Starvation, disease, infrastructure collapse. The Imperium is a terrible system, but it is a system. And systems provide stability, however unjust that stability might be. So we perpetuate injustice because dismantling it would cause chaos. We perpetuate an imperfect order," I corrected, "because the chaos that would follow its dissolution would kill trillions. But that does not mean we accept the current state as permanent. It means we work to improve it gradually, to reform what can be reformed, and to minimize harm where reform is not yet possible." The young ultramarine considered this. "And if reform fails? If the Imperium cannot be changed? Then we will have bought time for human populations to survive. And perhaps centuries from now, someone will find solutions we could not. The purpose is not perfection. It is persistence. Humanity survives not because we succeed at everything we attempt, but because we refuse to stop attempting." He returned to his post, and I did not know if my answer had satisfied him. But it was the only honest answer I could give. The purpose of the Imperium, such as it was, had become simply to continue existing. To maintain the minimal conditions for human survival across a hostile galaxy. It was not inspiring. It was not the grand vision my father had articulated. But it was real, and it was necessary. I thought about that conversation for weeks afterward, about what it meant to fight for something you knew was fundamentally flawed, about whether maintaining an unjust system was morally defensible if the alternative was worse, about the difference between idealism, which insisted on perfection, and pragmatism, which accepted incremental improvement over generational timescales. My father had been an idealist. He had envisioned a rational, enlightened civilization freed from superstition and united in pursuit of humanity's transcendence. That vision had been beautiful and inspiring and, ultimately, impossible. Humanity was not rational enough to maintain such a civilization. When faced with the horrors of the Horus heresy and the Age of Strife, most humans had turned not to reason but to faith, because faith provided comfort that reason could not. I could not restore my father's vision, but I could preserve the possibility that someday, perhaps millennia from now, humanity might be ready to attempt it again. That was the true purpose of my resurrection. Not to save the Imperium, which was already dead, but to maintain the conditions under which humanity might eventually save itself. It was a purpose measured in geological time. I would spend centuries, possibly millennia, holding together a civilization that was slowly dying, buying time for futures I would never see, enabling possibilities I could not predict. I would make decisions whose full consequences would not be visible for generations after my own death, if I were capable of dying. This was what it meant to inherit a dying Imperium. Not to save it, because salvation was not possible, but to slow its decline enough that something might survive. Some fragment of human potential, some possibility of recovery. Some chance that the species my father had sacrificed everything to protect might endure long enough to fulfill the potential he had seen in us. My name is Roboute Guilliman. I went to war for a rational Imperium and woke up to one that is dying. I have spent years trying to understand how this happened, how the civilization we built could become so thoroughly corrupted, and I have come to understand that it was not corruption, not really. It was evolution. The Imperium adapted to circumstances we had not anticipated, and in adapting it transformed into something we would not have recognized. But it survived. Against impossible odds, through 10,000 years of constant warfare and internal decay, the Imperium survived. Not because it was perfect, but because it was flexible enough to sacrifice everything, including its own founding principles, in service to continued existence. That is the Imperium's true strength. Not its military might, or its industrial capacity, or its territorial extent. Its willingness to sacrifice anything for survival. It sacrificed the imperial truth for faith because faith was more effective at maintaining social cohesion. It sacrificed efficiency for redundancy because redundant systems were more resilient to disruption. It sacrificed justice for order because order kept more people alive than justice ever could. These were not choices I would have made. They violated everything I believed about proper governance and human dignity. But they were choices that allowed humanity to persist when more principled approaches would have led to extinction. I cannot save the Imperium my father built, but I can maintain the Imperium that has evolved to survive in his absence. I can make it marginally less cruel, slightly more efficient, incrementally more just. Over centuries, these small improvements might compound into something meaningful, or they might not. I will continue regardless, because what else is there? I am the Lord Commander of the Imperium. I am the Avenging Sun. I am a Primarch of the Legiones Astartes, created to lead humanity toward a better future. That future has been indefinitely postponed, perhaps cancelled entirely. But my duty remains. Not to achieve victory, which is impossible, but to minimize defeat, to buy time, to preserve possibilities. I will fight wars I cannot win, implement reforms that will be corrupted or ignored, make compromises that betray my principles. And I will do all of this knowing that in 10,000 years, if anyone remembers me, they will likely remember only the compromises and betrayals. They will not understand the impossible choices that drove them. They will judge me by the standards of a better world than the one I actually inhabited.